Welcome to Watchtower History.
For those inside the camp, the war raging beyond the walls was far removed from their daily plight of suffering and sickness. But for those outside, trying to survive and evade arrest, every day was filled with terror and brushes with death.
In 1943, we were bombed out by the Allies. And since Mannheim was bombed out to 80% with incendiary devices, with phosphor bombs, we were the only ones in the house which were downstairs in the basement, because my parents didn't want to go to the bunker, which was only about 5 houses away, because they were looked after them because they were Jehovah's Witnesses. So now they came in, they bombed our house, and we were sitting in the basement. And of course, phosphor is very dangerous to the point if it's a jelly-like liquid, and if it is ignited, it takes away the oxygen and you suffocate. You have to realize, as a child, you hear the roar of those 4 mod bombers, and it is a sound like vroom, and you hear the sirens going off, and you know they dropped leaflets before, a day before, they're coming and bombing your town, that something will happen, and everyone is talking about it, and you as a child, you overhear the conversations. That puts something into you, the fear. And so that night when we were bombed out, you could hear the roar of those 4 mod bombers coming. And the next thing you hear were the bombs. And they were like, and if you heard the explosion, you were fortunate. If you did not hear the explosion, you were dead. My father did not vote for Hitler in 1933. The whole town came in front of his house. Who lives in this house? A traitor and a spy. And if they would found him that day, they would have lynched him. And so he knew that Jehovah's Witnesses were now in great danger. Also, a neighbor of his, Mr. Book, which was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, he was arrested a little bit later on and sent to Buchenwald concentration camp. From the 25,000 Jehovah's Witnesses, about 10,000 were incarcerated. Due to the maltreatment and so on, about 2,000 lost their lives.
Faced with the looming threat of what they would do to me if I didn't go and was caught, I decided to hide in the mountains. So I made my way up the steep face of the Salzkammergut Mountains, where I took shelter in the alpine forest. For days I hiked deep into the mountains, eating only bread and wild dandelions.
The Salzkammergut was becoming a dangerous place. With the Allied advance, the SS was on high alert.
Unknown to me, a Nazi patrol was looking for me. Their guide, Franz Kein, was a former workmate of mine who knew the mountains well. Days had turned to weeks. Heavy rains gave way to ice and snow. Before long, I was trekking in deep snow, wandering aimlessly through the freezing cold mountains. Tired and hungry, I finally broke down and decided to turn back. But where? Johan's Meister eben Alpine hut. When I arrived, I started a fire on the open hearth. The warmth gradually returned to my chilled body. It had been days since I slept. As I lay peacefully asleep, I suddenly felt indescribable pain. I had no choice then but to return to Johan's, or I would die. Shaking with fever, it took me hours to make my way back down the mountain. When I arrived, I awoke Franziska. I am in terrible pain. I need somewhere to hide.
Go to your parents. You can't stay here. They're looking for you. It's too dangerous.
But when I arrived, no one would help me, so I hid in the hayloft. Finally, my mother brought me some food and a cool wet cloth for my burns.
Mr. Kepler, you were also taken away when you were very young. Was it 14? You
Yes.
went to the first of, what, half a dozen concentration camps?
That's right.
Now, your whole family went except for your sister?
That's right. My sister is the only survivor of my family, and she was hidden by Jehovah's Witnesses, even though at that time I did not know who they were, and she didn't know either because they were known by a different name in Poland. It was, and she was hidden by them under great danger for 2 years and 3 months.
Now, how did it come about then that a group of individuals that you weren't even that aware of came to hide your sister? How did that whole thing come about?
Well, she was married. Her husband was a musician, and he taught one of the children of the Witness family to play violin. And then when the time came for the cleaning out the ghetto in town, they invited him to come in. They didn't know at the time how long the war would last, but nevertheless they were committed to keep them right through until the end of the war, at a great threat to themselves.
Did she explain much about where she was hidden or how they
Yes.
went about doing that?
Yes. This was a small city apartment, which makes it particularly difficult as compared with being hidden someplace in a village. So they were in one big room, and they were standing all day behind the wardrobe, rather one large European wardrobes, and at night they would pull it away so they can lie down, but they stayed the whole time behind the wardrobe, absolutely silent without making any noise. It was tremendous. I mean, it was a very difficult thing, and she practically became a nervous wreck as a result. It was very stressful for her husband, as well as the witnesses.
Yeah. Now, were the witnesses free to come and go? How is it that the witnesses in Poland weren't taken to concentration
Well,
camps?
many of them were, but the action against witnesses was not as concentrated, apparently, as it was in other countries. Now, I did not know the details about this family, since my sister didn't know. They would sort of spend their life behind the wardrobe, and that didn't know what was going on outside. So this is not quite clear. But even in Germany, only about half of the witnesses were arrested, which is a substantial amount, but didn't cover everybody.
Now we knew that we were under surveillance and that we had to make a decision. And the decision was made that we now go to my grandparents' mother's side, where there was a big house in the valley and a little cabin in the woods. There in that cabin in the woods, we were now. But then also my grandparents had to leave the big house because so many refugees from the towns came and needed quarters because they were bombed out. And so in that little cabin we were about 6 people at times. No running water, no electricity. The outhouse was about 100 yards away, and the well where we could pick up the water was about 200 yards away. Every drop of water which we need to be picked up and cooked on a wood stove We only had kerosene lamps or candles, and that was it. And of course, towards the end of the war, everything was rationed and everything was in very short supply. And so we made the best of it. But it was not easy for a young person, because I could not go down and play with the other children, because questions could be asked. Who are you? Where are your parents? What are you doing here? And so on. So we were kind of separated from the rest of the people just to survive. Yes, the winter of 44, it was especially hard. It was very cold. And of course, I did not have new shoes, and the shoes had holes. And so some of my toes froze. They were brown already. And my grandma used an old remedy which she received from others of her family. She ripped the bedsheet apart in strips, rubbed it around my toes, put kerosene on, and that healed it. Within 2 weeks, my toes were back normal. And of course, that was also a very traumatic experience. It was cold. I think whenever I get cold, I think back to those days.
So Garba's book says that another Jehovah's Witness also tried to play for time by reporting a change of address and filing petitions. His father was born in Ukraine, was a stateless person. So finally, in March 1945, he decided to go underground and escape to the forest. There he lived in a cave and went to the village only to get food, and he remained in this hiding place until the end of the war. So I thought some of these stories are kind of interesting.
Well,
They survived.
but here's a lot of other people. I mean, you're a farmer. All the boys are off to war or killed or this and that. Here's a guy in a cave. Do you hire him? And, let him work on you and then play dumb. He goes, sleeps in the cave, then goes to the village and gets food with the money you pay. I mean, you just don't, those were difficult times, even if you weren't being persecuted.
One of the video clips that we played is a story about the gentleman. He had scoliosis. So he was hunched over, and he also had to escape out into the forest and live out there for a while because of just trying to avoid the Nazis. And there are a couple times in the film clip that, the Nazis are going out there and trying to find him, but somehow he was able to get away. So it's just interesting. Anton Latonia. He has a story in the February 8th, 2003 Awake that says by 1938, he had refused to Heil Hitler and became a member of the Hitler Youth. They fired him from his job. His brother was not a witness, but he gave him Rutherford's Enemies book. And his brother was convinced by it, I guess. And he says he stopped association with the Hitler Youth. And then his brother tried to cross into Switzerland, but they captured and executed him. So, some tried to hide, some got caught. But this gentleman, he was also a conscientious objector and refused the Heil. Yet he survived to tell his story. Erwin Close has a story in the November 22nd, 1992 Awake. As the war dragged on, it became more and more dangerous to walk the streets. He said, one night as a brother and I were leaving a secret meeting, someone bumped into me from the rear, and an object clattered to the ground at my feet. I picked it up and saw with horror that it was a German soldier's helmet. Its owner was standing by his bicycle and now beamed his flashlight on me. I walked over to him. He snatched the helmet from his hands, pulled out his revolver, and shouted, "You're under arrest." I was trembling. If he arrested me, it would probably be the end of me. I prayed to God for help. Hearing the commotion, a crowd formed. When I noticed the soldier was swaying slightly, it dawned on me he was drunk. Then I remembered the German military rules allowed officers to walk about in civilian clothes. So I stepped up to the soldier and shouted with all the authority I could muster, "Don't you know who I am?" The soldier was stunned. He clapped on his helmet and saluted me. So, convinced that he had insulted an officer, he sheepishly slunk off into the night. The bystanders scattered. I could only thank Jehovah for another narrow escape. And there are some stories like that with Tortured for Christ and some of the Richard Wurmbrand stories of very narrow escapes like that. I find those very, very interesting.
The purple triangle was the distinctive mark worn by the Jehovah's Witnesses, mostly known in Germany at the time as Bible students, taken from the earlier name of their official organization, the International Bible Students Association. Germans often called them Ernste Bibelforscher, serious Bible students. Nazi camp guards shortened it to the nickname BIFO.
When we went through the concentration camp, we saw this purple triangle. Then I knew there's my sister. I said, "Hello, sister, how are you? What's your name? Where you come from?"
The witnesses fared better in the camps than many prisoners. Absolute conviction in their faith and strict discipline helped their morale.
But the purple triangle was only introduced in 1938. And before that date, there were different symbols that were frequently also used for witnesses. Witnesses were assigned a black circular dot and a yellow stripe below their knee in Esterwagen, which is one of the Moor camps. In Lichtenberg, also one of the early camps, they were assigned blue circles to be worn on their chest and blue stripes on their trousers. Blue obviously blended much too closely to the blue and white striped zebra-striped uniforms that all concentration camp prisoners wore. As a result, this color was retracted and put into use again much later in the war for Spanish Republican prisoners, but by later in the war, Jehovah's Witnesses were all given the form of purple triangles.
Early in the morning, the new prisoners were led to the political section. As they passed the gate, Engleitner's eyes fell on the inscription, "To each his own." It indicated that the tortures everyone had to endure as soon as they entered the gate were nothing more than they deserved. After Engleitner arrived at the camp, he stood next to Dr. Heinrich Gleisner as their particulars were registered.
Als gefragt wurde, was from Beruf antwortete.
When Dr. Gleisner was asked what his profession was, he answered, "I'm a lawyer." "What, a Jew?" this S-man said, misinterpreting his answer, and hit him in the face. After that, it was my turn. They threatened to lock me up with the bears. At first, I thought this was funny, convinced that they were only joking. Later, when I saw the bears in the pit, I realized the danger I was in.
As a newcomer, I was allotted to the penal company and received an outfit marked by a purple triangle, which showed that I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and a black dot, which indicated that I was assigned to work in the quarry.
The quarry provided the stones for the road construction in the camp. Work in this unit was one of the greatest tortures that people had to endure in Buchenwald concentration camp.
When the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. was setting up its exhibits, it wanted some uniforms from the concentration camps, and they wanted uniforms that still had on them the triangle of a particular colour that would have indicated the status and the reason why the prisoner was there. So a yellow triangle would be a Jew, a black triangle would be a Catholic, perhaps a priest, a red triangle would be a communist, and the purple triangle was the witnesses. The only uniforms that they managed to find, and they are on display in the museum in Washington, D.C., were those with purple triangles, because witnesses were the only ones who had felt that they could wear their triangle as a badge of pride and had kept those uniforms and kept those triangles, just a couple of them at the end of the war. For everybody else, they had been a symbol of shame and horror, and they were destroyed very quickly. So it was possible going into a camp to see the group that you belong to. It was a way of the Nazis identifying people. It was meant to be a badge of shame, but for the witnesses it was always a badge of pride, because it said that in wearing that they were one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and it wasn't seen as actually part of the witnessing, making a stand. So the witnesses talk of and remember their purple triangle with pride.
All right, so the December 1st, 1969 Watchtower has a story that this person was witness to in 1926, and they were immersed the same year. So if they were immersed in 1926, what did that mean?
They were in between whether or not the Jews were going to get a reward or whether they were rejected by God.
And not only that, what did it mean for those who were immersed as a Jehovah's Witness, or as a Bible student in 1926?
If you're going that path, whether or not they were of the anointed or of the great crowd.
There was no great crowd yet.
Or
at least
Jonadab class.
Yeah, that was something a decade later. So they were baptized to the heavenly hope. Whether or not they kept that position, because a lot of them rejected it.
Changed it in 30.
Yeah, when it was changed, unknown. But he mentions in this story, and this is Martin Putzinger, he says, in 1931, we acquired the name Jehovah's Witnesses. Astonished faces appeared at every door when we introduced ourselves with the words, I come to you today as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. People would shake their heads and ask, but you are still Bible students, are you not? Or have you joined a new sect? So we'll get into some reasons for the name change in the future. There's a few possible ideas for that, and some of the documentation we've uncovered suggests some interesting reasons for the name. And so we'll do a deep dive into that here in the near future. This story continues. He says, the Gestapo visited me, and finding nothing incriminated, left me with the ultimatum. Stay inside the city of Munich or prepare to be sent to the concentration camp at Dachau. So he says he was falsely arrested as a spy, because remember, they're going after them. They think they're communist agents. Right? Yeah. He was jailed for 3 days, and then he was deported. So after returning to Germany, he was arrested and sent to a concentration camp for refusal to renounce his beliefs, basically. For refusal to acknowledge Hitler's government as the highest authority. He said there were 145 witnesses in the camp, and they tried every method to induce to break our faith in Jehovah. Starvation diet, deceitful friendships. Who could you really trust? Having to stand in a frame day after day, being hung from a 10-foot post by the wrists, tangled around the back, whippings. All these and others too degraded to mention were tried. The Jehovah's Witnesses in the Nazis book has an example from 1937. It says the Buchenwald concentration camp was opened and then directed by Commandant Koch. It had formerly been known as the Ettensburg concentration camp. In the days following, the first prisoners were shipped in from Sachsenhausen and the Lichtenberg camps. 149 and then 70 professional criminals were also sent during the third week. On July 27th, the first political prisoners arrived, among them 7 fundamentalists. So there are other Christian denominations that are also being arrested and put in the camps. By the autumn of 1937, the number of witnesses had grown at Buchenwald to about 270. That number swelled to 450 by the autumn of 1938. The camp population was about 2,500 in 1937. So approximately 1 in 10 inmates there was a JW. That's quite a big number, a big percentage. And so there is this Buchenwald report. So when they uncovered Buchenwald, there were a lot of interviews done, pulled together whatever documents they could find. And all of these are available in this book by Professor David Hackett. And he has a story in here about a special punishment company where they had severe beatings and they had a black cell block for isolation torture. And a lot of the Jehovah's Witnesses were put into that. Very, very difficult conditions. But on April 20th, 1939, for Hitler's birthday, the black cell block was finally dissolved. It wasn't producing the effect that they wanted. They thought it would break their will, to break their motivation, to break their faith. They thought they would just simply sign a document to get out, and all it did is strengthen their resolve. It had the opposite effect. In the JWs at Auschwitz, there's some documents about Bible students being there. You can see Bibel Forscher in the documents. There's a lot of documents about them. This is an entire book with lots of the documents, a lot of the photos. And we've seen some of those photos earlier in the conversation, in our discussion here.
And I've never read that book. Is that both Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews, and Bible students? Is it everybody and others?
This is just imprisoned for their faith, Jehovah's Witnesses in KL Auschwitz. They didn't make a distinction between the JWs and the splinter groups. So unless you know who is who, you couldn't really tell. And remember, there weren't just Jehovah's Witnesses. There were splinter groups that were also in those camps.
I've never read the books in pertaining to that. Sadly, I've just read the ones on how they tortured people and whatnot like that. I was more like fascinated. How do these people do this?
Yeah.
And go through with all that. This is minor compared to some of the stuff that I've read, but like you said, the black cell block.
Yeah.
Terrible how they put people. If anyone's ever, and most Americans would not know this experience, but if anyone's ever had to sleep, overnight in an airport, a subway, somewhere like that on a dry concrete floor, you don't wake up very pleasant. You can only imagine when the dampness gets sucks into your bones and into your feeling, and then it's wet on the floor, like this one says. It's just, they went through a lot.
No, it wasn't easy, but still, it didn't break. There are very few that signed the document to get out.
Yeah.
It didn't break their resolve. A lot of them kept the faith that they had. So this KL Auschwitz book has a story here. It says that Andrzej Szalbot was arrested because he refused to join. And after the interrogation and torture, he was imprisoned at Auschwitz. In his testimony, he says, "I was taken to the office of a Gestapo officer who specialized in Jehovah's Witnesses. On the wardrobe, there was a death's head. The Gestapo officer said to me, 'Will you give up? If not, this is what your head will look like.' I said, 'My conscience does not allow me to kill.' He replied, 'We will cure your conscience.' The beatings started again. I lost consciousness a few times. I was not able to walk out of there on my own. After 6 weeks of investigation, I was transported to Auschwitz."
It was funny how they said a specialist in Jehovah's Witness. When I was reading the book on Dr. Mengele, it talked about specialists. There was a specialist for this. And it's like, how do you get to be a specialist in the Nazi torture regime and in this? Do you, like he said, do you beat them better than you beat the others or something? What requires? And they did the same thing. They had specialists for alcoholics, homosexuals, drug addicts, Jehovah's Witnesses. They ran quite a regime, and it's amazing they even wasted resources to try and rehabilitate the few. It's like man doesn't know what they're doing, and crazy dictators don't know what they're doing. Are they being kind, rehabilitating a few while you're slaughtering millions over here? It's there's no logic behind what they do, and how much resources and buildings during a time of war they were having for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Only, I mean, the only productive use they got at them, and they figured out afterward, was make them build and do things. It's just a strange, but those are mostly Jews. It's just a strange. You can't wrap your head around that thinking.
I like that you mentioned that, because this next story is exactly that kind of thing. So in the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Nazis book, there's a story here about the Gestapo arrested this guy on July 14th, and he was incarcerated for 7 years. After 3 months of maltreatment in a cell at Frankfurt, he was sent to Buchenwald in a criminal convoy. After disembarking from the train, he was asked by an SS officer while he was there. He responded, "Because I am a Jehovah's Witnesses and I want to remain one," for which he was beaten. Assigned to a disciplinary work detail, he was given an inmate number and a purple triangle, basically. But even though he wasn't an electrician, he was told to take care of the electric fence they were building, So what he did is he wired it up, but he wired it up to make sure that the current wasn't running through the fence. It took them a while to catch on what was going on.
Well, it's like Hogan's Heroes. If you you would remember that Hogan's Heroes was actually entertaining. Watching, they really made a mockery of how people got by and stuff during the prison camps and everything that they did. And it's very interesting in some aspects. While they're torturing and beating people, they can be very humane to some others.
Yeah, it all depended.
And just the mood of the day. Just you're in a bad mood, you beat them. You're in a good mood. Here's another piece of bread. It's just there's no rhyme or reason what man will do to each other.
And we'll see in Himmler's case, and we'll look at Himmler a little bit later on, he actually grew an appreciation of the Jehovah's Witnesses because of how they stood firm. And then he was trying to think of ways, well, how can we use this to help the other prisoners work just as hard as the Jehovah's Witnesses? And they're building camps and such. So he was already trying to figure out a way to use that. In Garbe's book, he basically says that the Gestapo and the judges were in cahoots. So even after some of the IBSA were pardoned, they would be immediately arrested again and taken back into custody. And the Gestapo determined not only the acts of pardon, if they got it, but they also determined what the punishment was going to be. And the judges just had to follow suit, regardless of what the law said, There's an article in the February 27th, 1935 Golden Age that says Germany completely under the domination of Satan.
Let's not rile them up anymore.
Yeah. So what's going on here? So they're talking about these court cases, right? Which we just looked at in the previous slide. And they say the courts are completely under the domination of Satan, which, they were. But he says, for instance, one court sentenced a young man to prison because he showed his lady friend some scriptures in the Bible concerning God's kingdom. So his girlfriend turned him in, or somebody overheard them, right?
No, it was probably his girlfriend.
So,
he didn't give her roses that day. Not worthy. Turn him in.
This is a continuation of the same article. It says, were the IBSA, as represented by their advocates living in Germany, only a religious community? And were their members in Germany to concern themselves only with religion? Then this work and activity could never be prohibited. More especially, the National Socialistic State would not have the slightest interest in going up against their endeavors. And so I'm not sure I'm catching the logic of what they're arguing here. But, when the Gestapo, after this, when the Gestapo is going after the Bible students of the time period or Jehovah's Witnesses, what they're doing is they're taking these articles from the Golden Age and the Watchtower, and they start using it against them. Well, look what they're saying about the Nazis. So this became ammo for the Nazis to say, hey, you're against our government. They're just aggravating the situation yet again. Yet at the same time, they're standing firm against Hitler. So, where is that line? Where do you draw that line?
But again, going back, if they weren't sending the telegrams, a lot of it was aggravated. A lot of it was poking the beehive. They some of it could have been left alone. Would it have been bad? Probably. But again, someone is going to beat you up, like Mike Tyson on the airplane. Okay, Mike will do it. Why provoke him even more to get him to do it? Just sometimes it's best to leave things be, and that's a lesson they don't seem to learn.
This article continues, and they say there can consequently be absolutely no question of the prohibition of the IBSA as having infringed upon the Constitution of the Reich. For Article 135 and the following ones, in view of the aforementioned, alone possible sense and purpose, and then what really comes into consideration, not the single letter, to cover and protect purely and exclusively religious societies. And so they're saying, well, we're a religious society, so we should be protected. And yet, that's not really why they're going after them. They're going after them not because of their faith, but because they're accused of being communist agents. So the Nazis are even taking Watchtower literature, as we saw in some of these documents, and they can't find any evidence that they're communist agents. So they just arrest them anyway. Has nothing to do with their faith. Because they're being accused of communist agents, because they're being accused of being Jews or Zionists, then later because they refused to Heil Hitler, and then of course their conscientious objection and their neutrality stances. So there's a lot of various reasons why they're being picked on or chosen.
Now, the witnesses will focus on the Heil Hitler.
Yeah, they do focus on that.
But there is a lot more to it.
And the witnesses, much like the Jews, say, well, we're, God's chosen people. It reminds me of Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof.
I know, we are the chosen people. But once in a while, can't you choose someone else?
That's my favorite line in that movie. Yeah. Probably religiously for movies, that's my favorite line. Can you choose someone? No, actually, I think you said, can you choose someone else once in a while?
Yeah. Okay. So there's this Lydia Herman who was 22 years of age. Her husband was also put in a concentration camp as a former communist. So here in the Watchtower literature, they're telling us that is the reason they're going after the Jehovah's Witnesses, that they're being accused of being communist agents. Mrs. Louise, who was 42 years old, had to appear before the Dortmund Council as an account for distribution of forbidden literature and the dissolved Association of Bible Students. So again, even the Watchtower literature is giving one of the main reasons the Nazis are going after them is because they're being accused of being communist agents. In the Golden Age of June 5th, 1935, there's also some stories as well about various ones that were put into camps.
Well, here you go. One policeman, while making an arrest, said, "It is terrible with all these telegrams we got." Okay?
Yeah, there's the telegrams again.
So then he goes, generally, the police just ask, are you one of Jehovah's Witnesses? And that's enough for them. Okay, you could obviously see they're based on even the own Golden Age article. They're not happy. It didn't do anything to help them. It provoked it even further. So about 100 brothers were sentenced to 3 months imprisonment. Would it
I
have been
don't-
a week, a month? What? You could see the retaliation there,
Yeah,
even in their own words.
And the question we have to ask, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit later on, is did they realize that they were poking the bear, that they were provoking the situation, instead of trying to calm the situation down? This Buchenwald report has some more examples of how the Jehovah's Witnesses were persecuted. And one here says, on the first day of Easter, 1939, the roll call officer made another attempt to persuade us to recognize the state and the Fuhrer. Mocking names like Heaven's Comedians and Bible Worms were the order of the day. Success was 0. At Pentecost 1939, the entire Jehovah's Witness block was ordered to appear at Roll Call Square. After a speech by the SS Second Lieutenant Hackman, there began a terrible exercise period divided into 2 parts. There was rolling, hopping, crawling, and running. This went on for an hour and 15 minutes, while the block officers urged us on with sticks and the heels of their boots. And so after the outbreak of World War II, on September 6, 1939, all the JWs were called to the main gate. Deputy Commandant Rodel proclaimed, "You know that war has broken out and the German people are in great danger. New laws are taking effect. If you refuse to fight against France or England, then you must die." 2 companies of SS guards in full battle gear stood at the gate. Not one witness declared himself ready to follow the demand of the deputy commandant to fight for Germany. After a moment of silence came the sudden command, "Hands up, empty out your pockets." Then these gifts to the world and representatives of the Reich of Justice and Peace fell upon us and took away our last pennies. At an inspection of the domestic service detail by the deputy commandant, all the JWs were gathered together and sent to work in the quarry, even though 90% were war casualties. There was during this time no hospital treatment for the witnesses. Only faith in the justice of divine retribution sustained and supported us. And so they were hoping for God to vindicate them and God to punish the Nazis. There's no lesson of forgiveness here or love.
Consolation.
Yes, the Consolation, after the Wake changed its name. The December 12th, 1945 issue, and this would have been after the war. There's a long article about the Jehovah's Witnesses and how they triumph over the concentration camps. When the wrath of a war-mad world was flaming at white heat against Nazi Germany, the Roman Catholic hierarchy, and of course, they're always blaming the Catholics for everything during this period, in the United States seized upon that moment to brand Jehovah's Witnesses as Nazis, Nazi sympathizers, fifth columnists. These epithets were flung at God's Christian witnesses as thick and fast as cries of Reds and Communists, which the Nazis were accusing them of. The change in the rabble-rousing hierarchy's name-calling tactics came when much of the odium attaching to communism was shifted by an unstable public to Nazism. But was this new cry any truer than the false charge of their being communists?
Well, one has to remember, too, this is coming from Consolation, from a Watchtower publication. So typically they don't quote the sources where they get their information from. And again, was this one Roman Catholic priest saying this? His own personal? Was the whole Catholic Church condemning? You have to take that into account when you read this particular article, because unlike the 1974 yearbook, which matched what history and what other documentation and evidence said, a lot of this is just what Watchtower's version of things is.
And I think most of this, nearly all of this, I think all of this actually matches what is found in the record. And I like the fact that, they're stating what they were accused of. They were accused of being communist. They're giving personal testimonies, and a lot of those personal testimonies match the personal testimonies and documentation we find in the Nazi accounts, in the Nazi records, in the records of the scholars. So I think, on a whole, this is pretty accurate. I don't think they're giving the whole story, unfortunately.
That's where
Yeah.
I'm going.
And why? Again, we're going back into, again, they're being accused of being communists. Why? Sometimes that question is the most important question. Why are they being accused of being communists?
But remember,
and so we're going to get into that.
The Nazi Germany was also against the church and the churches themselves. So remember, they called the council together. So they were telling the church what to do and this and that. It was not a full, to me anyway, from what I've read and my take on it, it wasn't a full Roman Catholic hierarchy that seized against Jehovah's Witnesses. It was political, oriented in the back. But we'll go on. We'll see where it ends up in the end.
So they give some examples here, and there's a story here that says there was a flogging of 5 prisoners, where a Bible student in particular was brutally ill-treated by the camp commander in person. After the Bible student had received 18 strokes, he moaned from the pain. The head of the commander was crimson red, and he roared loudly, "You Schwein, cry to your Jehovah that he help you. Why doesn't he help you? Call to him that he crush us. Then you can trample on us." Then they flogged the Bible student until he became unconscious. Nevertheless, 7 more strokes rained down on him. They unbuckled him from the torture stake, and he fell down like a sack. He was lifeless on the floor. There are a few books on the subject where it goes into this concordat that the Catholic Church had drawn up with the Nazi Party. Is it as Jehovah's Witnesses claim? You can take a look at the books and decide for yourself. I still have to research that myself. That wasn't a part of this story that we're getting into. We're looking at what the Jehovah's Witnesses were accused of, how they stood firm, and then we're going to look at some of the reasons why they were accused of these certain things, and also we'll get into some of the details of these letters that they wrote to the Chancellor of Germany, to Hitler, and to the Third Reich, and to look at some of the details of why they're writing what they wrote. So stay tuned for that. That'll be one of our next discussions. It'll be very, very interesting.
So actually, there is some evidence of the Catholic Church in the United States that did seize some opportunities upon Jehovah's Witnesses and the sympathizers and all that.
And we have an example of what you're saying. We have an example of that with Father Coughlin, who he and Rutherford had quite the relationship. And we'll get more into Father Coughlin's story and his ties to the Nazis in a future discussion. Because if you look at our discussion on intolerance with the machine gun story with Watchtower and what happened in New Jersey, that really, that the Catholic opposition to the Jehovah's Witnesses at the time really caused quite a stir here in the United States. And both Father Coughlin and Rutherford, because of their hate speech, were banned from the radio. And so we'll get more into that story in that future discussion. After many years of total confinement in this especially rigidly guarded camp, the first opportunity has been afforded us, as it's reported here, through the grace of the Lord and your kind provision, to come once again into contact with the costly things out of the house of the Lord, and to refresh ourselves with the wonderful food from his word. You would be astonished if you could see with what calm assurance we sit here to this richly prepared table. So remember, they were cut off from the outside world. They weren't getting the literature from Watchtower. And so as we saw in one of those earlier slides, there were some disagreements with the witnesses as to what should be believed or how they should act in certain situations. And we'll see more of how this plays out later on in this discussion, as we'll see how some of these Jehovah's Witnesses who disagreed with each other treated each other. So there's a story here about Dr. Maurer, who declared that these men were repeatedly offered release from the camp. Remember, if they could sign a declaration they could get out, and the Jehovah's Witnesses were the only ones who were given that opportunity. It wasn't because of their religion, it wasn't because of their blood or their race, as in the case of the Jews. It was because they thought they were part of a communist conspiracy, a part of a communist coup. And so they thought if they could be re-educated, or if simply offered to renounce their faith, they would just let them go. And so, in this story here, it says 800 men were offered this. Out of the 800, only 3 accepted. And the suggestion they're making here is that Buchenwald said, well, they weren't active witnesses of Jehovah. So, again, is that entirely true? We'll look at some of that in that future part of the discussion when we get there. So Professor Garbe talks about the prisoners with a purple patch. He says that these Bible student prisoners, however, had received their own exclusive mark of identification. Besides the IBSA members, the category with a purple triangle included only some members from Bible student groups that separated from the Watchtower Society, and we'll get into their story a little later on, but also members of the Adventists. However, the Adventists represented only a very small number. The SS did not consider them to be at all different from the Bible students. So they were making a connection with them and the Adventists. Well, why? Because a lot of the earlier Watchtower theology, Russell's theology, a lot of that was very, very similar to the Adventism. And it came out of the Advent Christian denomination roots. So there was a tie to Adventism. By the time you get to the Rutherford period, a lot of that had changed and it becomes something entirely different, something entirely new. So I could see how some of the Adventists might have been brought into that. So if the Jehovah's Witnesses are being accused of being communist agents, and they have some Adventist roots, well, the Adventists must be part of the same accusation. So I could see how they would confuse the matter and try and bring them in as well. So this is not a Bible student giving the report. This is somebody else. This is a survivor's testimony. The behavior of these earnest Bible students is truly amazing. These people demonstrate an unyielding spirit of resistance. They manifest the courage of martyrs and display a steadfastness that is without equal within the concentration camp. From the beginning, we political prisoners have made an agreement among ourselves not to rebel and to submit to all instructions coming from the concentration camp administration. We know that the SS officers just wait for an opportunity and would not hesitate to take action against us. Therefore, we give the required Hitler salute, etc. Here they're giving the Hitler salute. However, there is absolutely nothing that would move the earnest Bible students to give the Hitler salute. Their faith in Jehovah prohibits them from doing so, and they act in harmony with their faith. Several of them even refuse the offer of being released from the concentration camp. Some of them state they will stay in the camp until they will again be allowed to perform their religious activities. So that's very, very telling. The Imprisoned for Their Faith book says that many prisoners remember the JWs who always obeyed orders if their conscience allowed them to do so. So even when obeying them, they could have lost their lives. They did the assigned work conscientiously, often beyond their strength. They were kind towards other prisoners, and they believed that by suffering captivity in the camp for Jehovah, they would deserve salvation. Thus, they usually humbly accepted their fate. So they believed strongly that if they died in the camp, they would be assured of their salvation. So what the Nazis were doing was creating martyrs. Martyrs for their faith.
You cannot have a martyr.
Yeah, and they all would follow that. It was known that these prisoners wouldn't do anything contrary to their religious beliefs and convictions. They wouldn't take any action directed against another person, even if that person hurt them, even if it was an SS man. As for commands, they would perform any, even the most obnoxious jobs, under the condition that it was morally neutral for them. They waged passive resistance on all war and violence. Due to the purple triangles, the Bible student prisoners could find their fellow believers in the camp because they were all wearing the same purple triangle. So keeping in touch with others and receiving mutual help was necessary for all prisoners, but especially for those who worked in the so-called tough commandos, because in addition to the exhausting work, they were exposed to beating and battering from the capos. Now, a capo was a fellow prisoner who was given a position above the other ones. They were like a guard, but a prisoner guard. So it took Jan Obtrepsky, a Pole who was registered in the camp as a political prisoner, a few months to find his fellow believers, until the day when he, completely exhausted because of the extremely hard work, noticed a group of prisoners with purple triangles not far from the roll call square. At first, they treated him with reserve. Well, why? Because you don't know who you can trust. You don't know if he's someone trying to infiltrate your group. You don't know if you can trust him. And he was wearing a red triangle, so of course that made it even more suspicious. A red triangle was a political Polish prisoner. However, the knowledge of the Bible and of the Jehovah's Witness publications he showed convinced them that he too was a JW. So, it was hard for them to know who they could trust. Here is Block 15 at Auschwitz, and I've been in this building a couple of times. I've been there. So the JWs met every evening before the roll call near Block 15, where they supported one another by kind words and raised each other's spirits. They also organized meetings for prisoners who showed interest in their teachings and shared what they received in the parcels from their families. They helped in obtaining medication and, as far as they could, in moving those who were completely exhausted to another better commando. In accordance with the principles of their faith, they never took part in any activities organized by the Camp Resistance movement. They also maintained a non-political stance. And there's a prisoner Johannes Steyer, who drew paintings of his experience in the camp. And the Jehovah's Witnesses in Kale Auschwitz book has several photos of the various prisoners, the women prisoners as well as the male prisoners. The black senior was Mitzi, a fellow Bible student prisoner. One former prisoner remembers her humane attitude towards the other female prisoners. And it was said of her, when Julia Skodova had to spend her first night in that block, the black senior, her name was Mitzi, came into the room and wished them Gute Nacht, Kinder, in her Viennese dialect. It was as if someone had stroked me. This is how friendly words were received in that environment. So they did find some ways to, even their words were an encouragement sometimes. So Kirsten John Stuke has a section in Hesse's book. He says, the SS threatened them with the worst possible mistreatment. Statements from the victims as well as the fellow prisoners attested to the fact that the maltreatment in the weeks that followed was intended to kill these prisoners. The 26 witnesses were assigned to the Forest Penal Work Crew. There, together with the asocial and protective custody prisoners, the witnesses had continuously to carry rocks at the double up a steep slope. The SS brutally beat and abused them. They were housed in a barrack that only had dirty straw spread on the floor. They were denied medical care. The witnesses who were not involved did their best to help their brethren. Although it was prohibited, they tended their wounds, provided them with additional food rations collected from other witnesses, and gave them emotional support and comfort by Bible readings. According to their own testimony, this solidarity and religious faith enabled the 26 witnesses to survive 6 months in the penal labor commando, while remaining true to their beliefs. The other prisoners in the penal labor crew were unable to cope with the mistreatment, and at least 2 prisoners attempted to escape and were shot by the guards. There's a Carl from Leipzig who gives his testimony and how the JWs were treated. And he says he arrived in Buchenwald in January 1939 without a court hearing. At a certain point, they just got rid of law and order. He says, upon my delivery, Sergeant Young asked whether I still believed in Jehovah as God. When I answered yes, he beat and kicked me until I could scarcely hold myself upright. 3 of my teeth were broken and my left eardrum ruptured. I was immediately placed in the punishment company where the senior black inmate at the time, Paul Weitz, raged like a madman. I had, however, the good fortune to be spared from his fits of rage. The work was terribly difficult. With loads of that often amounted to more than 165 pounds, we had to run at double time and were driven on with truncheons while doing it. We worked from early morning until evening, even on Sundays, when other prisoners' work ended at noon on Sunday. The punishment company had to stand at Roll Call Square until 7 or 8 at night and received nothing to eat. After 3 months had passed, I was taken to the paint shop and released from the punishment company. Since that time, I have personally suffered nothing more. So he was spared a lot of it after he got out of that. And then finally...
And that's, you going back to that without a court hearing, that's when basically Gestapo had full reign of what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
They were the court.
They pretty much decided the law and order. They were changing the laws little bit by little bit all the way through. But here, just kind of get rid of it. And here they just get rid of it, put them in the camps and abuse and maltreat them. And so there's a book that Sarah Helm wrote, If This Is a Woman. And it's the subtitle here is Inside Ravensbrück, Hitler's Concentration Camp for Women. And it talks a little bit about Himmler and his reaction to the Jehovah's Witnesses. Kogel now appeared to Himmler for even greater powers to break them. The only way he insisted was to beat them. Random beating took place every day, but Kogel asked for authorization to use a method used in male camps. This official beating meant strapping a prisoner stomach down over a wooden horse and giving them 25 lashes on the buttocks with an oxhide whip. Such punishment could only be authorized by Himmler himself, and to date he had refused to permit it. Why he had withheld it at Ravensbrück is not recorded, but we know that Johanna Lagenfeld believed that such thrashing to be unnecessary and had made it clear she was opposed. Himmler asked first to see the Jehovah's Witnesses in their cells before he made his mind up. Kogel was proud of his new prison. Stone-built, surrounded by pine saplings, it was impenetrable. Dorothea Binz, the Forster's daughter, and Maria Mando, a more experienced Austrian guard, had been chosen to run the new bunker, which made them almost as powerful as Johanna, and certainly more feared. No other women guards might enter without Kogel's say-so. By the time Himmler arrived on January 4th, 1940, the Jehovah's Witnesses had been kept in the bunker for 3 weeks. A guard unlocked one of the doors. Himmler and Kogel peered into the darkness at a huddle of starving, freezing women crammed inside a wet, stinking cell. The women were praying. Himmler was heard to comment that they were in a bad way. Among the first group were Erna Lundorf and Marianne Korn, their white headscarves barely visible as they prayed in silence in the freezing darkness. Both women had spent at least 5 years in prison for refusing to give up their faith. Both had been amongst those hosed down like drowned mice during the Lichtenberg riot. It was day 21 of their bunker arrest when Himmler appeared, recalled Erna Ludolf. He let the guards open a cell door for him, and he got a fright at the sight of us. Now he spoke. "Don't you see that your God has left you? We can do with you whatever we like." One of the Jehovah's Witnesses in the cell responded, "God will save us, and if he does not, we will not serve you." Himmler stopped outside another cell. Again he asked for the door to be open, and he peered inside. He asked a young woman called Ruth Brooke if she was ready to renounce her faith. She said, "I will only follow God's rules." Himmler replied, "Shame on you, girl," and turned to go. And so here's some of Himmler's story. We're just touching on a little bit of it. We'll get to more of his story a little later on and how he reacted to the Jehovah's Witnesses towards the end of the war.